Okay, so you want to run a black market. Move some product, undercut the legal price, collect the difference, repeat. Here's the part nobody tells you. The product moving through your operation is the least valuable thing you handle. In 2021, the OECD and the EU Intellectual Property Office valued global trade in counterfeit goods at $467 billion, roughly 2.3% of everything imported on Earth that year. And the operators moving that volume are running margins on the goods themselves that a legitimate wholesaler would recognize instantly, because the goods are incidental to what they actually sell. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what a black market actually sells, why a truckload of ordinary cigarettes can out-earn a truckload of cocaine, why the two forces killing this industry are the same two forces that built it, and why the most valuable asset in the entire operation is a number written into somebody else's tax code. Black markets come in three sizes, and they are three completely different businesses. At the bottom sits the individual runner. One vehicle, one route, one crossing at a time. The Tax Foundation ran the math on the most cited version of this in the United States. A person buys 800 cases of cigarettes in Virginia, where the state excise tax is 30 cents a pack, drives them to New York City, where state and city excise runs $5.85 a pack, and sells them into the local market. That single truckload clears roughly $4,080,000. One truck, one driver, one afternoon on I-95. A Virginia State Police agent quoted in the same reporting put it plainly that trafficking cigarettes now carries a higher profit margin than cocaine, heroin, marijuana, or guns. The middle tier runs containers. Researchers studying tobacco smuggling found that a shipping container holding 10 million cigarettes, exported with duty unpaid, could be purchased for around $200,000 and sold into the contraband market for roughly $2 million, 10 times the money on a single container. In Australia, customs analysts documented tobacco costing $150,000 with a street value near $10 million. And the reason container fraud dwarfs everything else is volume. UK customs figures from 1999 found £50 million lost to smuggling by air passengers, £340 million to cross-channel bootlegging, and £1.4 billion to container smuggling. Same product, same country, same year. The container is where the money lives. At the top sits the manufacturer, someone producing the counterfeit goods themselves, running actual factories, actual supply chains, actual export logistics. China accounted for 45% of all reported counterfeit seizures in 2021, and one estimate puts Chinese counterfeit cigarette production above 400 billion units a year. At this tier, the operation looks like a manufacturing company, because functionally, that's what it is. So why does anyone do this? For decades it worked because of one structural fact. Governments tax certain goods heavily to discourage their use, and the gap between the taxed price and the untaxed price is pure waiting margin that anyone willing to absorb legal risk can walk into. That was the entire business model. Scarcity created by law. Then government started closing the gap from both directions, and the scarcity began to disappear. Now the question that actually matters. Where does the money come from? Here's the part that reorganizes how people think about this. Go back to that Virginia truck. The cigarettes in it are legal. They're manufactured by a legal company, sold at a legal wholesale price, in a legal transaction. The driver bought real product from a real distributor. Nothing about the goods is contraband at the moment of purchase. What makes that truckload worth $4 million is the $5.55 difference between what Virginia charges per pack and what New York City charges per pack. The cigarettes are the delivery mechanism. The tax gap is the actual inventory. That reframing explains the entire industry. Illicit trade accounts for roughly 11 to 12% of the global cigarette market, around 657 billion cigarettes a year, costing governments somewhere between $40 and $47 billion in annual lost revenue. The WHO's own framing is that tax differentials drive this, and a pack of a major Western brand costing a little over $1 in a low-duty country can retail for up to $10 in the UK. $9 of value created by nothing except crossing a border. Which is why the product category barely matters. Counterfeit handbags, untaxed cigarettes, diverted pharmaceuticals, smuggled fuel, they're all the same trade, wearing different clothes. Each one exists because a legal price and an illegal price diverged far enough to pay for the risk of moving between them. Change the product and the economics stay identical. Close the price gap and the business evaporates regardless of how good your logistics are. Customs investigators have a blunt way of describing the thing they actually chase. They hunt unpaid excise. The cargo is simply where that unpaid tax happens to be sitting on the day they open the container. That is the entire model in one sentence, and it explains why enforcement agencies report their own success in recovered revenue rather than tonnage seized. It's the same structure as any arbitrage desk on Wall Street. Buy where the price is low, sell where the price is high, and pocket a spread you did nothing to create. The difference is that a currency trader's spread comes from market inefficiency, and a smuggler's spread comes from a legislature, which means the smuggler's entire business model sits at the mercy of people who can vote it out of existence on a Tuesday afternoon. Now, the part that makes this business genuinely clever once you see the numbers behind it. Roughly 25 million cargo containers enter the United States every year, about 48 containers every minute. U.S. Customs and Border Protection physically inspects around 3% of the containers arriving by ocean vessel. In the European Union, the figure for scanned cargo runs closer to 1.5%. Worldwide, estimates put container inspection somewhere between 2 and 10%. Sit with what that means as a business input. An operator moving a container is playing a game where the base rate of physical inspection sits near 3 in 100, and where the majority of containers that do get physically inspected produce no seizure at all. That's a probability to be priced, the same way an insurance company prices a claim rate. Move enough containers, absorb the expected fraction of losses, and the arithmetic still clears comfortably. A seizure stops being a catastrophe and becomes a line item, budgeted for before the first shipment leaves. Which is why the entire industry concentrated on ocean freight. Look at how those inspection rates split by transport mode. Ocean containers, about 3% physically inspected. Trucks, about 24%. Rail, about 90%. Nobody builds a smuggling operation around rail freight, because 9 out of 10 loads get opened. The trade migrated to the channel with the friendliest odds and stayed there. Route selection in this business was always a probability calculation, wearing the costume of a logistics decision. The same reasoning explains the bribe. Paying an official is a purchase of certainty. The operator is buying down a probability, converting a variable loss rate into a fixed cost, the same way a legitimate firm buys insurance to turn unpredictable losses into a predictable premium. Every serious operation carries that line item, and it survives on the arithmetic that it costs less than the seizures it prevents. Force 1. The legal market moved in and took the spread. The clearest case is cannabis. For decades, the entire value of illegal cannabis came from prohibition, the risk premium baked into every transaction because there was no legal alternative. Then jurisdictions started legalizing. Legal supply chains matured. Retail infrastructure scaled, and prices in legal markets fell hard. The illegal operators in those markets found themselves selling a product a customer could now buy at a store, tested, taxed, and receipted, at a price the illegal channel struggled to beat. A black market built entirely on scarcity has nothing left once the scarcity gets repealed. The same logic runs through every category. Where governments have narrowed tax differentials between neighboring jurisdictions, the arbitrage compresses and the traffic drops. Where they widen the gaps, traffic climbs. Studies consistently find a positive relationship between cigarette tax rates and smuggling volume, which is the same finding stated from the other direction. The industry's revenue is a direct function of policy divergence, and policy converges over time as governments coordinate. There's an uncomfortable corollary buried in that relationship, and enforcement agencies are well aware of it. Every tax increase intended to discourage consumption also widens the spread that funds the illegal channel. Raise duties far enough above a neighbor's rate, and the state effectively subsidizes the smuggler, handing them a larger margin without spending a cent. Illicit penetration tends to sit in the low double digits across mature markets like the EU, and runs dramatically higher in regions where neighboring tax rates diverge sharply. The black market is, in a literal sense, a product of tax policy, and it grows roughly in proportion to how uneven that policy gets. Force 2 is the one that took the industry by surprise, and it's infrastructural rather than legal. The supply chain became legible. On May 20, 2019, the European Union switched on the largest product traceability system ever built. Every pack of cigarettes produced in, destined for, or sold within the EU now carries a unique identifier, and the system tracks more than 30 billion individual products a year at every step from factory to point of sale. It took 6 years to develop. By May 2024, the requirement expanded to cover all tobacco products. The WHO protocol behind it set a 2023 deadline for cigarette traceability worldwide and a 2028 deadline for every other tobacco product, which means this infrastructure is currently being replicated across dozens of countries on a treaty clock. Understand what that does to the container model. The entire container tier depended on product disappearing. Legal cigarettes exported with duty unpaid, then quietly vanishing in transit and reappearing on a street market. Researchers found in the 1990s that roughly a third of the world's legal cigarette exports simply evaporated somewhere between the factory and the declared destination. That vanishing act is what the whole trade was built on, and a system that logs 30 billion individual products at every handoff makes vanishing structurally difficult. Authorities can now identify the exact point where a product left the legal supply chain and entered the illicit one. The effect compounds in a way that's brutal for operators specifically. Better traceability raises seizure risk, which raises the expected loss rate on every shipment, which forces prices up to cover it, which pushes price-sensitive buyers toward whatever legal alternative exists. Weaker demand then makes it harder to justify the fixed costs of routes, bribes, and warehousing, so the operation shrinks, which makes it easier to surveil. Every cycle of the pattern makes the next cycle slightly worse. There's no obvious point where it stabilizes back in the operator's favor. Step back for a second. A black market is a business built entirely around a price difference it has no control over. The goods draw the buyer. The legislature sets the margin. The operator survives on a spread that a policy change can close overnight, in a category where getting caught carries consequences no legitimate business faces. That's a fragile foundation in the best years. In a decade where legal markets are absorbing entire product categories and traceability systems are making the supply chain readable, the structure gets squeezed from both directions at once. Smaller spread means less revenue. Higher seizure rates mean higher costs. Both arrive at the same time, and neither responds to anything the operator does. 3 scenarios, real numbers. Scenario 1, the individual runner. Startup cost as a vehicle and the purchase price of the load. That Virginia to New York run generates a genuinely enormous return on a small capital base, and it's why this tier persists despite everything. It also carries the least protection. One traffic stop ends the business. There's no organizational buffer between the operator and the charge, and the tier depends entirely on interstate tax differentials that a single legislative session can compress. High margin, zero durability. Scenario 2, the container operator. $200,000 buys the load, and the sale returns roughly 10 times that. The economics are excellent, and the exposure is enormous. The operation requires port access, freight documentation, warehousing, and enough people in the chain that any one of them becomes a liability under pressure. It also sits directly in the path of the traceability systems now going live across dozens of jurisdictions. The tier with the best margins is the tier most exposed to the infrastructure being built specifically to read it. Scenario 3, the manufacturer. Real factories, real payroll, real export logistics. Producing goods at industrial scale in a jurisdiction where enforcement is thin. This tier captures the widest margin because it owns production instead of buying it, and it's the only tier with genuine durability, since a manufacturer can pivot product categories when one gets legalized or traced. It also requires the largest fixed capital base, the most people, and a physical footprint that cannot be moved or hidden on short notice. The tier with the most staying power is the one that looks least like crime and most like a factory, which is precisely the point. Same goods, same routes, same century-old arbitrage. The difference between a healthy year and a collapsing one comes down to decisions made in legislatures and standards bodies that no operator has any influence over at all. For most of modern history, the black market held one durable advantage. It could move goods through a system nobody could see into, and the paperwork of global trade was fragmented enough that a container could genuinely disappear between 2 ports. That opacity was the moat. It's why researchers in the 1990s could find a third of the world's cigarette exports going missing in transit without anyone being able to prove where they went. That moat is closing every year. 30 billion products logged annually in Europe alone, expanding globally on a treaty timetable. Customs authorities running pattern analysis on traceability data specifically to find the geographic signatures of illicit activity. Legal markets absorbing the categories that carried the widest spreads. So the operators still working are the ones who understood something structural about this trade. The margin lives in the distance between 2 numbers written by 2 different governments who weren't talking to each other. The product was always incidental. The logistics were always incidental. And every year, those governments talk a little more.